My life was a symphony of success, a perfect path from one promotion to the next. Then, a single word changed everything: cancer. My vibrant world turned into a nightmare of sterile walls and painful treatments. I felt alone, a ghost in my own life, until a group of strangers became my family. They saw not my illness, but my soul. They taught me that hope is not a feeling, but a choice. This is our story. My life was a timeline, a perfect path from one promotion to the next. At 29, I was a successful architect, a woman who lived for her work and found solace in the precision of her art. My friends were my colleagues, my social life was the office happy hour, and my purpose was my career. I believed that success was the only thing that mattered, and I was on my way to the top. I was building a beautiful, flawless life, and I had no time for anything else. The diagnosis of cancer shattered it all. It was a single word, a single moment that turned my vibrant world into a nightmare of sterile walls and painful treatments. The doctor's voice was a low, emotionless drone, and his words were a final blow. "Gia, we have to start treatment immediately. It's an aggressive form of cancer." The words hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't breathe. My life, my purpose, my identity, it was all gone, just like that. The next few months were a blur of pain, fear, and hopelessness. I was a ghost in my own life, a woman who was so obsessed with her work that she had no time for anything else. My friends and family tried to help, but their words felt hollow. "You'll be fine," they said, their voices full of fake hope. "You're a fighter." But I wasn't. I was a failure. I was a ghost. I was nothing. I felt alone, a patient defined by her disease. I was so sick of the constant pings of my phone, messages from people who meant well but didn't understand. I had lost my ambition, my creativity, my will to live. All I had was my anger and my despair. I was a ghost. My doctor, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Lee, was a constant source of pressure. She was a woman who saw her patients as human beings, not as cogs in a machine. She was a woman who was obsessed with her work, but who had a heart. "Gia," she said, her voice a low, melodic rumble, "I know this is hard, but you are not alone. There's a support group in the hospital, and I think it would be good for you." I was resistant. I was a private person. I was a woman who had never shown my emotions to anyone. A support group felt like a public display of my own despair, a final confirmation that I was a failure. I was a ghost, and I was not going to be seen. I was not going to be judged. I was not going to be loved. I was going to be alone. I was going to be a ghost forever. The first meeting of the support group was a Tuesday. My mother, a woman who was so worried about me that she had become a ghost herself, forced me to go. "Gia," she said, her voice a low whisper, "please, just for a little while, for me." I was exhausted, and I didn't have the energy to fight. I walked into the room, filled with cynicism and a sense of dread. The room was small, but it was filled with people, all of them strangers. They were all different ages, different genders, different backgrounds. They were all patients, just like me. They were all ghosts, just like me. I sat in the back, silent and closed off, a fortress of despair. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to hear their stories. I didn't want to see their faces. I just wanted to disappear. But then they started to talk. They started to share their stories, their pain, their victories. I saw an older wise man named Mr. Kim with a peaceful smile who talked about how he had fought the disease for 10 years. I saw a young, angry teenager named Minji who talked about how she had lost her hair and her friends. I saw a middle-aged woman named Eunmi, a mother and a wife, who talked about how she was scared of being a burden to her family. I saw a young, handsome man named Juan who was surprisingly cheerful, who talked about how he had lost his dream of being a photographer. Their stories were raw, honest, and filled with a pain that I knew. They were not just patients, they were human beings. They were not just ghosts, they were people. They were fighters. They were heroes. And in that moment, my cynicism turned into a quiet respect. I was not alone. I was a part of something. I was a part of a community. I was a part of a family. I was a person again. And in that room, filled with strangers, I felt a sense of belonging that I had never felt before. The support group was not just a group of people with cancer. It was a group of people who had found each other. It was a group of people who had found hope. It was a group of people who had found love. The group leader, a kind and gentle woman, encouraged new members to share their stories. I initially refused. I was a ghost, and I was not going to be seen. But then, the angry teenager, Minji, looked at me, and her eyes were full of a quiet rage. "What's wrong with you?" she said, her voice a low whisper. "Are you too good to talk to us? Are you too good to be here?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I was so angry that I couldn't speak. But then, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to talk. I wanted to talk about my anger, my despair, my resentment. I wanted to talk about the beautiful, flawless life that I had lost. I talked about my life, a life that was so obsessed with success that it had no room for anything else. I talked about how I had lost my job, my friends, my purpose. I talked about how I was a failure, a ghost, a nothing. I talked about how I was so sick of hearing the words, "You'll be fine." I talked about how I was so sick of hearing the words, "You're a fighter." I talked about how I was so sick of hearing the words, "You're not alone." And as I talked, the tears came. A silent, hot torrent of shame, frustration, and sadness. I was a ghost, and I was crying in front of a group of strangers. I was a failure. But then, something happened. The others started to share their own stories of anger and grief. They talked about how they had lost their jobs, their friends, their purpose. They talked about how they were a failure, a ghost, a nothing. They talked about how they were so sick of hearing the words, "You'll be fine." They talked about how they were so sick of hearing the words, "You're a fighter." They talked about how they were so sick of hearing the words, "You're not alone." They understood. They saw me. They saw my pain. They saw my heart. The shared experience created a fragile bond, a sense of belonging that I had never felt before. And then, Juan, the cheerful young man, shared a story that made us all laugh. He talked about how he had tried to take a selfie with his bald head and how he had accidentally sent it to his boss. The story was so absurd, so ridiculous, so funny that we all laughed. The laughter was a balm, a welcome change from the noise of our own minds. I was no longer a ghost. I was a person again. I was a person who was a part of something. I was a part of a community. I was a part of a family. The support group meetings became a constant in my life. I was no longer a ghost, a woman who was so afraid of being seen that she had become invisible. I was a person who was a part of a community, a person who was a part of a family. The group members started to connect outside of the meetings. Yunmi, the middle-aged woman, shared tips on managing family expectations. She taught me that it was okay to be a burden, that it was okay to be vulnerable, that it was okay to be loved. She was a constant source of support, a constant source of love. Mr. Kim, the older, wise man, was a constant source of inspiration. He told me stories of his own journey, of how he had fought the disease for 10 years, of how he had lost and won, of how he had learned to live with the fear of a relapse. He taught me about patience, about resilience, about hope. He was a constant source of wisdom, a constant source of strength. He was a person who had a purpose, a person who had a passion, a person who had a life. He was a person who was not a ghost. And then there was Juan, the cheerful young man, who was a constant source of hope. He was a man who was filled with a quiet dignity, a man who was so kind and so gentle. We spent long hours together talking about our lives before cancer. He told me about his dream of being a photographer, a dream that was so close to his heart. He talked about how he had lost his passion, his purpose, his will to live. He talked about how he was so sick of hearing the words, "You'll be fine." He talked about how he was so sick of hearing the words, "You're a fighter." And as he talked, I saw a flicker of sadness behind his cheerful facade. I saw a person who was just like me, a person who was in pain. I saw a person who was not a ghost. He was a person who was a part of something. He was a part of a community. He was a part of a family. He was a person who had found hope. He was a person who had found love. The group was now a family. We were not just a group of people with cancer. We were a group of people who had found each other. We were a group of people who had found a home in each other's hearts. We were a team. We were a dream. We were a revolution. The biggest challenge came when Minji, the angry teenager, got a bad test result. Her world was shattered again. The despair returned, and this time it was deeper. She was devastated. She was furious. She lashed out at everyone, including me. "You don't understand," she said, her voice a low scream. "You're not a failure. You're not a ghost. You don't know what it's like to be me." The words were daggers, and they pierced my heart. I felt my old cynicism return. I wanted to leave. I wanted to go back to my quiet, lonely life. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to be a ghost again. Juan, a man who was always so patient and kind, found me. He saw my struggle, my despair, my fear. He took my hand, and he said, "Gia, I'm scared too. I'm scared of losing my hair. I'm scared of losing my dreams. I'm scared of losing my life. I'm scared of losing my hope." The words were a confession, a declaration. My heart was pounding. I was in a dream. I was in a fairy tale. I was so happy that I could cry. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a quiet dignity. "Gia," he said, his voice a low whisper, "we have to face this together. We are not just two people. We are a team. We are a family. We are a revolution. We are a story." His vulnerability was a powerful moment for me. He was not just a man who was in pain. He was a man who was in love. He was a man who was a part of something. He was a part of a community. He was a part of a family. He was a person who had found hope. He was a person who had found love. The support group was now a family. We were not just a group of people with cancer. We were a group of people who had found each other. We were a group of people who had found a home in each other's hearts. We were a team. We were a dream. We were a revolution. We all rallied around Minji. We shared our stories of hope and resilience, reminding her that she was not alone, that her fight was our fight. Mr. Kim, the older man, told a moving story about how he had overcome his own despair, and it gave Minji a glimmer of hope. "You are a warrior, Minji," he said, his voice a low whisper. "You are a fighter. You are a hero, and a true hero deserves a chance." The words were a final blow. Minji was defeated. She was in awe. She was in love. She was in a dream. I, who was once so closed off, took a step forward. I organized a small gathering for the group, a simple dinner at the hospital's cafeteria, to celebrate our small victories. The act of planning something, of being a leader, gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. I was not just a patient. I was a person. I was a person who was a part of a community. I was a person who was a part of a family. I was a person who was a part of a revolution. I was a person who was a part of a story. I was a person who was a part of a dream. I was a person who was a part of a life, and in that I found hope. I found love. I found myself. The love between me and Juan deepened into something more profound than love. It was a bond built on shared pain and mutual support. We were no longer two people who were alone in their fight. We were a team. We were a family. We were a revolution. We were a story. We were a dream. We were a life. We spent long hours together, talking about our fears, our hopes, our dreams. He helped me find my old hobbies again, and I helped him rediscover his passion for photography. We were a constant source of strength for each other. We were a constant source of love. We were a constant source of hope. We were a constant source of happiness. We were a constant source of life. We were a constant source of a new life. We were a constant source of a new beginning. One evening, we were sitting on a bench in the hospital's garden. The air was cool and crisp. The stars were twinkling in the distance, a sea of diamonds. We were alone, and the world was silent. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a quiet dignity. "Gia," he said, his voice a low whisper. "We are not a couple. We are not just friends. We are soulmates. We are two people who were meant to be. We are two people who have found each other in the chaos of life. We are two people who have found a home in each other's hearts. We are a team. We are a family. We are a revolution. We are a story. We are a dream. We are a life. We are a new life. We are a new beginning. We are a new hope. We are a new love." The words were a promise, a vow. I hugged him, and the tears came. "I love you too, Juan," I said, my voice a whisper. "You are my home. You are my life. You are my everything." The words were a confession, a declaration. My heart was pounding. I was in a dream. I was in a fairy tale. I was so happy that I could cry. The happiness was short-lived. I got a bad test result. My world was shattered again. The despair returned, and this time it was deeper. I felt like a failure. I felt like a ghost. I felt like a curse. I felt like I was a burden. I felt like I was a nothing. I felt like I was a nobody. I pushed everyone away, including Juan. I felt like I was a ghost. I felt like I was alone. I felt like I was a failure. I felt like I was a nothing. I felt like I was a nobody. I was on the verge of giving up. I was on the verge of being a ghost forever. I was in a dark place, a place of despair and hopelessness. I was ready to give up. I was ready to vanish. I was ready to be a ghost forever. But then I felt a presence, a warm, familiar presence. I looked up and I saw them, the group. They were all there, standing in front of my hospital room, their faces a mask of love and determination. They were not just a group of people with cancer. They were a family. They were a revolution. They were a story. They told me that I was not alone. They told me that my fight was their fight. I found the strength to fight again. The group was with me every step of the way. They were no longer just a support group. They were a family. My journey was not just a journey of fighting cancer. It was a journey of finding a community, a family, a home. It was a journey of finding a purpose, a passion, a life. It was a journey of finding a new life. The story ends with a hopeful moment. Juan and I, now in remission, are sitting in the park, laughing. We are two people who were once strangers, but who are now bound by a love that is stronger than any disease. We are not defined by our illness, but by our love, our resilience, and our unwavering hope. We are a new passion. Thank you for listening to our story. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe to the channel for a new episode every day. We'll be waiting for you. See you in the next story.